Commander Velthari had trained spies and infiltrators for 40 cycles aboard the military station known as the Silent Blade. And in all that time, he had never once doubted his ability to judge a recruit within the first few seconds of meeting them. His 4 compound eyes could read body language across 17 different species. And his mandibles could taste the chemical signatures of fear and confidence and deception that most beings leaked without knowing it today. As he stood on the observation deck above the main training chamber, he tasted something he had not expected from the newest recruit standing alone on the floor below. He tasted nothing at all. The human female was utterly unremarkable in appearance, standing at average height with brown hair, pulled back in a simple tie and pale skin that showed every vein and every flush of blood beneath its surface. She wore that standard gray training uniform that all recruits received, and she carried no weapons and no equipment of any kind. Her name was Mira Chun, and she was the first human ever selected for the Joint Coalition Infiltration Program behind Velthari. The observation theater was filled with the best young operatives from 12 different species, all of them watching the human with expressions ranging from amusement to outright contempt. A young Kethrai named Silvex leaned back in his seat, his scales already shifting colors to match the dark metal wall behind him as he practiced his natural camouflage without even thinking about it. "Commander," he said in a voice dripping with false respect, "I must ask why the Coalition accepted a human into this program at all, because from what I can see on my display, our sensors are tracking her heartbeat from 3 decks away without any difficulty whatsoever." Soft laughter rippled through the theater, and Velthari did not silence it because he shared the sentiment even if he would never admit it publicly. The Kethari were born with chromatophores in their skin that allowed them to become visually invisible against any background. The Volpari possessed organs that dampened their electromagnetic signatures until scanners passed right over them. The Sindith could suppress their bioelectric fields so completely that even the most sensitive detection equipment would register them as empty space. Every species in this room had evolved some natural advantage for stealth over millions of years of survival and predation. The humans had evolved nothing. They were loud and warm in their hearts, pumped blood through their bodies with a rhythm that any basic sensor could detect from across a room. They sweated and breathed and radiated heat like small furnaces, and their bodies were so utterly incapable of hiding that Velthari had initially rejected the human application to this program 3 times before the Coalition Council overruled him. The Council believes the humans have something to offer, Velthari said to his students without turning around, and it is our duty to discover what that something is. Even if we suspect the answer is nothing. He activated the communication system that would broadcast his voice to the training chamber below, and he watched the human raise her head to look at the observation window with calm brown eyes that betrayed no emotion at all. "Specialist Myra Chun," Velthari announced, "you are about to undergo the standard evaluation that every recruit must pass before advancing to active training. And I want you to understand that this evaluation has a 100% success rate among the species represented in this program." The human nodded once, but said nothing. "The exercise is simple," Velthari continued, "and you will have 30 seconds to complete it, which is more than twice the time required by our slowest successful candidate." He gestured to one of his assistants, who activated the sensor display that now dominated the main screen in the observation theater. The display showed a 3-dimensional representation of the training chamber with a single bright point of light in the center representing the human next to the point of light. A data readout scrolled continuously. Heart rate, 72 BPM. Respiratory rate, 14 breaths per minute. Core temperature, 36.8 degrees. Celsius electromagnetic signature. Normal human baseline bioelectric output. Normal human baseline. As you can see, Valthari said to his students, our sensors have achieved full lock on the human's biosignature, and they are tracking every aspect of her biological function in real time. He turned back to the window. Specialist Chun, your task is to disappear from our sensors within 30 seconds, and you may use any method available to you. Though I notice you have declined all equipment and technological assistance, I will not need any equipment. Commander, the human said, and her voice was as calm and flat as her expression. More laughter from the theater. Sylvek's S-scales flickered with amusement, shifting through 3 different shades of mockery. The Cathrai candidate completed this exercise in 4 seconds, Valthari said, and the Volpari candidate required 7 seconds. And even the Sindith candidate, who holds the slowest record among successful applicants, required only 12 seconds. He paused. Your instructors on Earth sent a message with your application file that claimed you were exceptional among your species. And I am now going to give you the opportunity to prove that claim. Marichan stood perfectly still in the center of the chamber, her arms loose at her sides, and her breathing slow, and even I understand. Commander, Valthari checked the sensor display one final time, confirming that every system was functioning at peak efficiency and that there was no possibility of technical error. The human's heart beat steadily at 72 beats per minute. Her lungs filled and emptied with mechanical regularity. Her body radiated heat in the infrared spectrum like a beacon. In the darkness, she was the most visible thing in the entire station. Begin, Valthari said, and Mira Chung closed her eyes. The observation theater fell silent as every eye and every sensor focused on the human standing. Alone in the training chamber below, Sylvex leaned forward in his seat, his scales settling into a neutral gray as curiosity began to replace his earlier mockery. And beside him, the other students watched their individual displays with the careful attention of predators, observing prey. The sensor readout continued its steady scroll across the main screen. Heart rate, 72 BPM. Respiratory rate, 14 core. Temperature, 36.8 degrees. Commander. Valthari watched without expression, his mandibles pressed tightly together as he waited for the inevitable moment when the human would admit defeat and request technological assistance. 5 seconds passed the human's heart rate began to drop. 717069. She's calming herself, a Volpari student named Catherine observed with a dismissive wave of one slender hand, which is admirable for stress management, but ultimately futile because our sensors can detect cardiac activity down to 15 beats per minute, and there is no way a human can reduce their heart rate below that threshold without losing consciousness. 65, 60, 55. Catherine stopped talking. 50, 45. Commander Valthari felt something cold move through his thorax as he watched the numbers continue to fall. And for the first time in 40 cycles of training the most dangerous operatives in the galaxy, he did not understand what he was seeing. 40-35. That should not be possible, one of the assistant instructors whispered, because the human cardiovascular system requires a minimum heart rate to maintain blood pressure to the brain, and anything below 40 beats per minute should cause immediate unconsciousness. 30. The respiratory indicator began to change as well. 14 breaths per minute became 10, then 8, then 4. Then the indicator flatlined completely, and the human in the training chamber had stopped breathing entirely. 25 BPM. The thermal signature began dropping at the same time, and the numbers fell with a speed that defied everything Valthari knew about mammalian biology. 36 degrees became 35, 35 became 34, 34 became 33. The human was not just slowing her heart, She was systematically shutting down every biological process that could be detected by sensors. And she was doing it without any external assistance and without any visible effort. 20 BPM. Sylvex rose from his seat without realizing he had moved, his scales frozen in a pattern of alarm that he could not control. And his voice cracked when he spoke. "She is dying," he said. "She is actually killing herself to pass this test. And someone needs to stop her before she 15 BPM. The sensor display began to flicker as the computer struggled to maintain lock on a cardiac signature that was barely strong enough to qualify as alive. 12 BPM, 10 BPM. Core. Temperature. 30 degrees and falling. Electromagnetic signature. Approaching background levels. Bioelectric output. Minimal, Commander. Valthari could not speak. He could not move. He could only watch as the bright point of light representing the human began to fade on the three-dimensional display, growing dimmer and dimmer as her body approached a state that was closer to death than life. 8 BPM. The point of light flickered. 6 BPM. The point of light went dark. The sensor display updated with two words that no one in the observation theater had expected to see. Biosignature. Null target. Lost. The most advanced detection systems in the Coalition, capable of tracking a Sindith through 3 meters of solid steel, capable of detecting the heartbeat of a Volpari from across a starship, capable of following a Kethri even when he was completely invisible to the naked eye. These systems could no longer find the human. She had not moved from her position in the center of the training chamber. She had not activated any cloaking device or stealth field. She had not done anything except stand perfectly still with her eyes closed, and she had ceased to exist. Commander Valthari found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Time," he said. The assistant instructor checked the chronometer with shaking hands. 19 seconds. "Commander, 19 seconds. The Kethray had completed the exercise in 4 seconds using millions of years of evolved camouflage. The human had completed it in 19 seconds using nothing but her own mind and her own body and her own impossible will. And then, just as suddenly as she had vanished, Mira-Chen returned. Her eyes opened, her chest expanded as she drew in a long, slow breath. Her heart rate climbed rapidly on the sensor display. 20, 35, 50, 65, stabilizing at a healthy 68 beats per minute. Her body temperature rose as blood began flowing normally through her veins once more. The point of light on the three-dimensional display blazed back into existence, bright and clear and utterly impossible. The human looked up at the observation window, and she smiled. It was a small smile, a polite smile, the kind of smile that a person might offer when they had just demonstrated something that everyone in the room had believed to be impossible. And they did not want to seem impolite about their victory. "Exercise complete, Commander," Myra-Chen said. "And I hope my performance was satisfactory." No one in the observation theater said a word. No one could find the words to say. They had just watched a human die and then choose to live again. And none of them would ever look at the species the same way. The silence in the observation theater lasted for nearly 30 seconds before Sylvex finally spoke. And when he did, his voice carried none of the mockery or contempt that had filled it just minutes before. "What was that?" he asked. And the question was not directed at anyone in particular, because no one in the room seemed capable of providing an answer. Commander Valthari turned slowly from the observation window, his compound eyes moving across the faces of his students as if seeing them for the first time. And what he saw was fear, pure and absolute fear. The Kethrai were the masters of visual camouflage, able to blend into any environment so perfectly that even trained observers could look directly at them and see nothing. But when they hid, their hearts still beat, their lungs still breathed, Their bodies still hummed with the electricity of life. The Volpari could dampen their electromagnetic signatures until sensors passed over them like water over stone, but they remained warm, remained breathing, remained fundamentally alive even when they were invisible to machines. Every species in the coalition that had developed stealth capabilities had done so while maintaining the basic functions of biological existence. The human had simply stopped existing. She had lowered her heart rate to levels that should have caused brain death. She had ceased breathing entirely for nearly 20 seconds. She had dropped her body temperature by almost 7 degrees in less than half a minute, and then she had simply decided to start living again, as casually as someone might decide to stand up after sitting down for a rest. "I want answers," Vanishe said to his assistant, "and I want them now. So pull up everything we have on human biology and find me an explanation for what we just witnessed." The assistant's fingers moved rapidly across the control panel, and within moments, the main display was filled with text and diagrams and medical data extracted from the Coalition's database on human physiology. Vanishe scanned the information with growing disbelief. Human biological capabilities. Autonomic override. The document began with a simple statement that should have been impossible. Through meditative techniques developed over thousands of years of their civilization, humans have demonstrated the ability to achieve conscious control over biological functions that are classified as involuntary in every other known species. Vanishe continued reading. Advanced practitioners of disciplines known as yoga and tamo and biofeedback training have demonstrated the following capabilities: reduction of heart rate to below 20 beats per minute, conscious control of body temperature, including the ability to raise or lower core temperature by several degrees, suspension of respiratory function for periods exceeding 10 minutes, and near-complete suppression of metabolic activity. The document included references to scientific studies conducted by human researchers, studies that had measured monks sitting in freezing temperatures while their body heat melted the snow around them, studies that had recorded yogis buried underground for hours without oxygen, studies that had documented individuals slowing their hearts to the point where medical equipment could no longer detect the pulse. These capabilities require no genetic modification. The document continued. No cybernetic enhancement and no external equipment of any kind. And they are achievable by baseline humans through training alone. Silvex made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sob. They can choose to die, he said. And then they can choose to live. And they do not need anything except their own minds to do it. A Sindh student named Rexall rose from her seat, her bioelectric field flickering with agitation that she could not suppress. "This is not possible," she said, "because the autonomic nervous system exists specifically to prevent conscious interference with vital functions. And no species should be able to override those protections without causing permanent damage. The humans can," Vanishe said quietly, "and the evidence suggests they have been able to do so for thousands of years." He thought about what he knew of human history, the fragments of information that had filtered through to the Coalition during the decades since first contact. Humans had not evolved as apex predators. They had no claws, no fangs, no natural weapons of any significance. They had no camouflage, no armor, no venom. They were soft and fragile and slow compared to the predators that had shared their world, and yet they had conquered their planet so completely that they had driven most of those predators to extinction. They had done it not through biological advantages, but through something else entirely, through will, through the absolute refusal to accept that anything was impossible simply because their bodies said it should be. "Commander," the assistant said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I have found additional information that you need to see." She transferred a new document to the main display. Human evolutionary history. persistence hunting. Before they developed technology, the document explained, humans survived as persistence hunters, pursuing prey across vast distances not through speed, but through endurance, chasing animals for hours or even days until their targets collapsed from exhaustion. The document described how humans had evolved the ability to regulate their body temperature through sweating, allowing them to run in heat that would kill other predators. It described how they had developed a mental capacity to override pain and fatigue, to keep moving long after their bodies should have forced them to stop. It described how they had learned to push themselves beyond every limit that biology imposed. Simply because stopping meant death and they refused to die, they did not evolve stealth capabilities, Valthari said slowly, understanding finally dawning in his mind. Because they did not need them for survival on their world. He looked down at the training chamber where Myra Chun still stood, her vital signs now completely normal, her expression calm and patient. But when they decided they wanted to disappear, he continued, they simply taught themselves how to do it, and they have been teaching themselves impossible things for as long as their species has existed. The fear in the observation theater had not diminished, if anything. It had grown, because every species in the coalition had assumed that biology was destiny, that the capabilities you were born with defined the capabilities you would always have. The humans had never accepted that assumption, and now the coalition was beginning to understand what that meant. Commander Valthari descended from the observation deck to the training chamber floor, and his students followed behind him in a loose formation that reflected their uncertainty. They were the elite of the coalition, young operatives who would never encounter a challenge they could not overcome through the natural gifts their species had given them. Now they walked toward a human female who had just demonstrated that natural gifts meant nothing compared to the power of a trained mind. Myra Chun stood at attention as they approached, her posture relaxed but respectful, her vital signs steady on the monitors that still tracked her from the observation deck above. Valthari stopped 3 meters from her and studied her face with all 4 of his eyes, searching for some sign of the impossible thing she had just accomplished. He found nothing. She looked exactly like what she was, an ordinary human with no special biological features, no visible augmentations, no external indication of the extraordinary capability she possessed. Specialist Chan, Valthari said, and his voice was carefully controlled to hide the turmoil he felt inside. I have been training infiltrators for 40 cycles, and I have never witnessed anything like what you just did. Thank you, Commander. It was not a compliment, Valthari said, though he was not certain that was true. Because I do not understand what I witnessed, and I require an explanation. Myra nodded as if she had expected this question. My people have a name for what I did, she said. Or rather, we have many names for it depending on which culture developed a technique. But the simplest term is voluntary suspended animation. Explain. Humans have known for thousands of years that the mind and the body are connected in ways that most species do not fully appreciate, Myra said. And our ancestors discovered through meditation and spiritual practice that this connection could be strengthened until the mind gained direct control over functions that should be automatic. She paused to let her words settle. My grandmother was the one who taught me, she continued, because she was a spy during a conflict on our world called the Cold War. And she learned the technique from monks in a mountain region called Tibet. Sylvax stepped forward, his scales shifting nervously through colors he could not control. Your grandmother was a spy, he repeated. And she learned to stop her own heart from monks. Yes, Myra said simply, because the monks had been practicing these techniques for thousands of years, long before my people understood the science behind them. And they had achieved levels of control over their bodies that our modern scientists still struggle to explain. But why? Rexel asked, her bioelectric field pulsing with confusion. Why would anyone learn to do something so dangerous? Because surely the risk of death is too great to justify the benefit. Myra's expression softened slightly. You have to understand something about humans, she said, and about the world we evolved on, because it was not a gentle world, and it did not forgive weakness. She looked around at the alien faces surrounding her, and Valthari had the sudden sense that she was seeing them differently than they were seeing her. My ancestors were not the strongest creatures on our planet, Mira continued, and they were not the fastest or the most dangerous. But they survived anyway because they refused to accept the limitations that nature had given them. When they needed to run, they learned to run farther than any other animal could follow. When they needed to endure cold, they learned to generate heat through force of will alone. When they needed to survive without food or water or air, they learned to slow their bodies until survival became possible. And when they needed to disappear, she said, looking directly at Commander Valthari, they learned to become so still and so quiet and so utterly empty of life that even death itself could not find them. The silence that followed her words was complete. My grandmother used to say something that I never fully understood until I grew older. Mira added, and she would tell me that the body does what the mind tells it to do, and the only limits we have are the limits we accept. She said that most humans never learn how deep that control can go, because they never have reason to push themselves beyond the comfortable boundaries of normal existence. But those of us who do learn, Myra said, and her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, we discover that there is almost nothing the human body cannot do if the mind commands it with sufficient conviction. Valthari felt a chill move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature of the chamber. He had trained Kethri who could become invisible. He had trained Volpari who could walk through scanner fields without triggering any alarm. He had trained Sindith who could suppress their bioelectric signatures until the most sensitive equipment in the galaxy could not detect them. All of them had been born with these abilities. All of them had inherited them from millions of years of evolution. The human standing before him had simply decided she wanted to disappear. And then she had taught herself how to do it. How long can you maintain the state? Valthari asked. The suspended animation you demonstrated. My personal record is 8 minutes, Myra replied. Though the human record is over 20 minutes for some of the most advanced practitioners. 20 minutes without breathing, Sylvex whispered. 20 minutes with a heart barely beating. 20 minutes as close to death as any living thing can come. Yes, Myra said. Though maintaining the state for that long becomes dangerous because there is a point where the body can no longer recover fully. And pushing beyond that point risks permanent damage. She smiled slightly. For infiltration purposes, 30 seconds to 2 minutes is usually sufficient, because that is long enough to bypass sensors and patrols and checkpoints. Long enough to become nothing until the threat has passed. Commander Valthari looked at his other students, at the Kethrai and the Volpari, and the Sindith and all the other species who had gathered to witness what they expected to be a human's failure. None of them were laughing. Now none of them looked superior or dismissive or contemptuous. They looked at Mira-chan with something Valthari had never seen in their eyes. Before, they looked at her with respect. 3 months passed aboard the Silent Blade, and in that time, Specialist Mira-chan became something of a legend among the students of the Joint Coalition Infiltration Program. She trained alongside the Kethris and learned to move through shadows with a silence that impressed even Sylvex, who had been born with the ability to become invisible. She studied with the Volpari and developed techniques for controlling her electromagnetic output that complemented her natural ability to suppress her vital signs. She practiced with the Sindith and discovered ways to minimize her bioelectric signature. That made her even harder to detect than she had been on her first day. But it was not her improvements that made her famous. It was the realization, spreading slowly through the station and then through the coalition itself, of what her existence actually meant. Commander Velthari filed his final evaluation report on the day Myra graduated at the top of her class, and the words he wrote would eventually reach every intelligence agency in coalition space. For 40 cycles, the report began. I have operated under an assumption that I now realize was fundamentally incorrect. And that assumption was that infiltration capability was determined primarily by evolved biology. I believed that species without natural stealth adaptations could never truly compete with those who possessed them. Because how could training and practice ever overcome millions of years of evolutionary development? The human specialist has demonstrated that this assumption is not merely incorrect but dangerously naive. The report described Myra's final examination in detail. She had been tasked with infiltrating a simulated enemy installation that was protected by every detection system the Coalition possessed. Systems that had been specifically calibrated to detect human biosignatures with maximum sensitivity. She had crossed the outer perimeter by reducing her vital signs to levels indistinguishable from the background radiation of the station itself. She had passed through a thermal checkpoint by lowering her body temperature to match the ambient 18 degrees of the corridor. Her skin cold as stone and her heart barely moving. She had walked within inches of guards whose equipment could detect the heartbeat of a synth through 3 meters of solid steel. And they had never known she was there. She had completed the mission in half the time allocated. And she had done it without any technological assistance whatsoever. Humans possessed no natural camouflage. The report continued. No electromagnetic dampening organs, no bioelectric suppression capabilities, and no evolved adaptations for stealth of any kind. What they possess is something far more significant and far more dangerous. They possess the ability to treat their own biology as a suggestion rather than a constraint. Given sufficient motivation and training, a baseline human with no modifications of any kind can achieve stealth capabilities that rival or exceed the most specialized species in the Coalition. This should not be possible, and yet it is. Velthari had paused for a long time before writing his conclusion, because he understood that the words he chose would shape Coalition policy for generations to come. I am forced to reconsider, he wrote at last. Not merely my assumptions about human infiltration capabilities, but my assumptions about human capabilities in general. If they can learn to stop their hearts through sheer force of will, what else might they learn? If they can teach themselves to disappear from our most advanced sensors, what other impossible things might they accomplish simply by deciding they wish to accomplish them? I do not have answers to these questions. I am not certain anyone does. But I believe it would be extremely unwise for the Coalition to underestimate this species any further. His recommendation was simple and direct. Expand human recruitment to all infiltration programs immediately, and begin studying their training techniques for possible adaptation to other species. The humans have discovered something that evolution never gave them. We would be fools not to learn from their example. The report spread through Coalition intelligence within days, and within weeks it had reached the highest levels of military command across 12 different homeworlds. Training programs were revised, recruitment policies were changed, and in quiet rooms where the most sensitive decisions were made, leaders of species who had once dismissed humans as biological inferiors began asking new questions. What else could humans do if they simply refused to accept that they could not? The answer came slowly, in fragments and rumors and classified reports that filtered through the intelligence community like water through stone. Humans who had trained themselves to survive in environments that should have killed them instantly. Humans who had pushed their bodies beyond every known limit of endurance, and emerged stronger than before. Humans who had looked at the laws of biology and said, "No, those laws do not apply to me," and then proved themselves right through nothing but determination and will. The coalition had believed that evolution was the ultimate arbiter of capability, that the gifts you were born with defined the ceiling of what you could achieve. The humans had never believed that. They had looked at the stars and said, "We will go there," even though they had no wings. They had looked at the depths of their oceans and said, "We will explore there," even though they had no gills. They had looked at the impossible and said, "We will do that anyway." And then they had done it, over and over again throughout their entire history as a species. And now they were looking at the coalition. They were looking at the Kethrai, and the Volpari and the Sindith and all the other species who had been given gifts by nature that humans would never possess, and they were saying, "Watch what we can do without those gifts. Watch what we can achieve when we have nothing but our minds and our bodies and our absolute refusal to accept that anything is truly impossible. Watch what happens when humans decide they want something badly enough." The coalition watched, and slowly, carefully, with a respect that would only grow over the centuries to come, the coalition began to understand humans were not a species that had been blessed by evolution. They were a species that had decided to bless themselves, and that made them the most dangerous thing in the galaxy.